Howdy, Howdyites. Okay, I'll work on that name. Some followers have asked for a video on making the chess pieces, and although not technically woodworking, I am working on it, and I hope to have those videos out pretty shortly. Before that, though, I thought I would do a quick review on a critical piece of equipment that's needed for these chess pieces, namely the pressure chamber. Welcome to Howdies. On a high level, there are two pressure-related chambers used commonly with epoxy, both centered at removing bubbles from the final projects, and both critical if you are making smaller epoxy or resin pieces. The first is a vacuum chamber, which works by effectively forcing the bubbles out of the epoxy. There are a number of great videos out there on the vacuum chambers and heating pads on YouTube, so I won't get into the details here. I chose a pressure chamber. A pressure chamber works by pumping air into a compressed enclosure and effectively shrinking the bubbles so small that they are invisible to the naked eye. It is generally a single-step process as opposed to a vacuum chamber where you need to constantly turn the pump on and off to allow the bubbles to pop as they escape. Now that I had decided on the pressure chamber mechanism, in part because I already had a compressor, I had to choose a size and model. Again, there is a wealth of information out there on all types of pressure chambers. There are even a few that show how to convert a Harbor Freight paint tank into a resin pressure chamber. This is probably the lowest cost option, just over $100. But it's really for those people who are comfortable with their modifying skills. I am not. I decided to purchase a chamber that was advertised as a ready-made chamber for resin projects. After significant research, I purchased the California Air Tools CA365C 5-gallon pressure pot. I even found it on sale for 10% off of its listed $300 price at Rockler, and also found it on sale at Amazon. Let's talk about the unboxing and my initial impressions, and then I'll discuss a few of the issues and concerns I had. The unit came packed very well with styrofoam bracing and wrapped very well, again, in plastic. There are 4 non-locking casters included, which are the only part that needs to be assembled prior to use if you choose to add them. I say if you choose to add them because sometimes having a mobile base can be problematic. The chamber can and will roll around when you are adding your pieces or tightening the lid. This can result in spilled epoxy or the pieces inside falling over. Using locking casters or removing the wheels completely might be a good choice for you. The wing nuts, which attach to the top, are oversized, and there are U-shaped cradles for each of the 4 of them welded into the top. This allows for the top to be easily and comfortably locked down before pressurizing the tank. The rubber gasket on the top seems very well made, and, spoiler alert, it has held up well for the year or so I've had it. The tank itself has a concave bottom and measures 14 inches deep from the sides to the top. The top sits up another inch or so when attached, which adds roughly another inch to your usable height for the inside. The sides are sturdy and a good balance between thickness and weight. The top includes an overflow safety valve, which I've not yet tripped or set because I operate well below the design PSI. The majority of the control is via a simple valve which opens when the valve is turned upward, meaning it then accepts and releases the air, and then it locks when it's turned parallel to the ground to retain the air and lock it in. There is also an easy-to-read pressure gauge attached to the intake valve and is a standard size which easily links to my air compressor hose. The manual indicates that this tank is capable of holding up to 80 psi, but the majority of resin casting or mold making I do is generally only around 45 to 50 psi. With that, I've had no issues with bubbles whatsoever. I have had some issues with the unit and had to ultimately exchange the first one I got to correct them. There was one issue that was not correctable. We'll talk about that in a second. My first tank had some chips around the top, which looked like they had been repaired and repainted, and a few other chips along the gasket on the top. There was a greasy substance that had dripped from one of the valves on the top onto the bottom inside of the chamber. The top also had what looked like some visible rust along one of the welds. I took it to the Rockler store in Houston, the one off Southwest Freeway, and a big shout out to that store manager, Brian, who opened his only other unit he had there so I could inspect it and ultimately exchanged it with no questions asked. Thanks, Brian. So what was the unfixable issue I mentioned? Well, notice when I was going over the dimensions, I didn't mention the diameter. Since I was making chessboards at the time, I needed at least a 13-inch diameter. The plan was that I would turn the chamber on the side and then insert a chessboard. I was looking to make the squares 1.5 inches each and then have a 1/2-inch border. If you do the math, even an Aggie can do that, it comes out with roughly 13-inch. So 13 inches was what I needed for the diameter. Now the listing on Rockler stated it was 13 inches. The specs on Amazon stated it was 13 inches. The video made by California Air Tools stated it was 13 inches. Even the description in the user manual stated it was 13 inches wide. Can you see the foreshadowing? After getting it home, I measured it and found that it was not 13 inches. I reached out to customer service at California Air Tools, and after following it up at least once, I ultimately received a "sorry, but 12 is close to 13 inches" explanation. My chessboards aside, the 13-inch tank also had another purpose. It would allow a full-sized 5-gallon bucket to fit inside the tank. This bucket allows you to create a flat floor and protects your chamber from spilled or leaking epoxy. It also makes it easy to use the handle and remove your items in and out. To fix this and make my bucket work, I had to cut off the handles and the ridge around the outside just so it would fit in. Okay, you're probably thinking enough about that 1 inch. The big question now is, does the pressure chamber do what it is supposed to do? Namely, does it take and hold the pressure constantly for the period of time? For my purposes, I needed the required pressure of 40 to 50 psi, and the time I needed it was for the time for my epoxy resin to cure, which is roughly 24 to 48 hours. I pumped the tank to just over 50 psi and began searching the web to pass the time. I let the pressure chamber sit for well over 24 to 48 hours, and then I checked it again. It was almost the exact same psi. So that answers the question. Yes, this pressure chamber works very well. I've now used it for literally dozens of chess piece sets and other small epoxy projects, and I have not had a single issue with the unit. Almost a year later, and it is still holding air with all the original parts and without issue. I can fully recommend the 5-gallon California Air Tools 365CR. Keep an eye out for my next few videos where I'll cover the design, the making of the silicone molds, and the final creation of the custom epoxy chess pieces. Until then, please be accurate in your measurements, and see you soon.